Ever pondered about the early life of one of the most notorious figures in modern history, Osama bin Laden? Our story begins in the bustling city of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, in the year 1957. Amid the glittering wealth of the country's oil boom, a baby boy was born into the house of Mohammed bin Laden, a self-made millionaire. The child was named Osama, and he was one amongst over 50 children born to Mohammed. Mohammed bin Laden was a man who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Saudi Arabia. His construction company had built much of the modern infrastructure in the country, amassing enormous wealth in the process. Osama, being one of his many sons, was born into a life of privilege and affluence. Yet, despite his wealthy upbringing, Osama's early life was shaped by more than just material comfort. The bin Laden family was deeply religious, adhering to a strict form of Sunni Islam known as Wahhabism. This religious influence played a pivotal role in Osama's formative years, instilling in him a deep-rooted belief in the tenets of his faith. Osama's education, too, was steeped in religion. He attended elite schools where religious studies were given prominence. His teachers often spoke of jihad or holy war as a noble cause. These teachings, combined with his family's religious background, sowed the seeds of Osama's later ideological leanings. As Osama grew older, he became increasingly devout. His belief in the principles of his faith, along with the societal and political upheavals of the time, began to shape his worldview. This was a period characterized by global tensions, the rise of religious extremism, and increasing anti-Western sentiments in many parts of the Middle East. This complex mix of wealth, religious indoctrination, and the political climate of the time would go on to shape Osama bin Laden into the man he would become. But in those early days, he was simply a boy growing up in a wealthy family, unaware of the path his life would eventually take. Thus, the seeds were sown for the man who would grow to shake the world. What transforms a wealthy businessman's son into a feared terrorist leader? This question has perplexed many, and the answer lies in the complex journey of Osama bin Laden. Born into a life of privilege as the son of a Saudi construction magnate, Osama bin Laden was no stranger to luxury. He attended the prestigious King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, where he studied economics and business administration. The young Osama seemed destined for a future in his father's empire, but his path took a drastic turn. As a university student, Osama became increasingly drawn to religious and political conflicts. He was deeply influenced by the teachings of Abdulaziz bin Baz, a leading Saudi scholar, who preached the importance of Islamic revivalism and jihad. This ideological shift marked the beginning of Osama's transformation. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Osama saw this as an assault on Islam, and it sparked a fierce sense of outrage in him. He decided to join the Afghan Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviets. Osama's involvement in the Afghan-Soviet War was a defining moment in his life. It was here that he gained his first taste of warfare and experienced the power of jihad firsthand. The war was brutal and long, but it fueled Osama's radicalization. He began to see the world in stark terms of good versus evil, Islam versus the West. He witnessed the suffering of the Afghan people and attributed it to the interference of foreign powers in Muslim lands. These experiences hardened his resolve and deepened his commitment to jihad. Osama's time in Afghanistan transformed him. The wealthy businessman's son was no more. Instead, he had become a battle-hardened warrior, a leader of men, and a zealous advocate for global jihad. His views became more radical, his ambitions more grandiose. As the battle lines blurred, a new persona emerged: Osama, the jihadist. From the ashes of war, a new threat arose: Al-Qaeda. But how did Osama come to lead it? The late 1980s saw the birth of a group that would go on to become a household name for all the wrong reasons. This organization was Al-Qaeda, and one of its key founders was none other than Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda, which translates to the base, was formed in the backdrop of the Soviet-Afghan War. Osama bin Laden, who'd been instrumental in recruiting and funding Mujahideen fighters during the war, saw an opportunity to harness this network of trained militants. An opportunity to establish an organization with a global reach, one that would fight against what he perceived as the enemies of Islam. Osama's role in Al-Qaeda was more than just that of a founder. He was the driving force behind its growth, the architect of its ideology. He leveraged his wealth, connections, and charisma to transform Al-Qaeda from a loosely connected group of fighters into a formidable terrorist organization. Bin Laden's vision for Al-Qaeda was clear: to establish a global caliphate, a single Islamic state ruled by Sharia law. He saw the United States and its allies as obstacles in achieving this goal, branding them as enemies of Islam. Through al-Qaeda, Osama aimed to wage a holy war, or jihad, against these forces. Under his leadership, al-Qaeda carried out several high-profile attacks in the 90s, each one more audacious than the last. These acts of terror were not just meant to cause destruction, but also to send a message that al-Qaeda was not a group to be taken lightly, that it was willing to go to any lengths to achieve its goals. Osama bin Laden's transformation from a wealthy Saudi businessman to the leader of one of the world's most feared terrorist organizations was complete. He had become a symbol of global jihad, a figure both revered and feared. Osama was no longer just a participant in global conflict, but a puppeteer. What marked the beginning of Osama's reign of terror, you may ask? Well, we can trace it back to the mid-90s when al-Qaeda, under Osama's leadership, began a series of audacious, horrifying global attacks. The first of these large-scale attacks occurred in 1998, leaving the world in shock. A double bombing of United States embassies in Kenya and Tanzania took place, killing more than 200 people and injuring thousands more. This attack wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration of war. For the first time, Osama bin Laden had successfully orchestrated an attack of this magnitude, and it was clear that he was not going to stop there. Then, merely 2 years later, in October of 2000, the USS Cole, an American-guided missile destroyer, was targeted while it was harbored and being refueled in Yemen's Aden harbor. A small craft approached the destroyer, and an explosion occurred shortly afterward, ripping a hole in the USS Cole's port side. 17 American sailors lost their lives and 39 were injured. This attack was another grim reminder of al-Qaeda's growing audacity and their determination to harm their perceived enemies. These attacks, among others, marked a new era of terror, a reign led by Osama bin Laden. He had become the face of a new kind of terror, one that did not distinguish between military and civilian targets, one that sought to cause as much havoc and fear as possible. His actions and the actions of those under his command were not just attacks, they were messages, grim reminders of their hate and their willingness to go to any lengths to make their point. So what marked the beginning of Osama's reign of terror? It was a combination of his audacious attacks on high-profile targets, his willingness to cause mass casualties, and his ability to instill fear on a global scale. The world was now in the grip of a new kind of terror led by Osama bin Laden. And this was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The date, September 11, 2001, is etched in global memory. But what role did Osama play? On that fateful day, 4 coordinated terrorist attacks by al-Qaeda shook the United States, targeting the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Virginia. The world watched in disbelief as the Twin Towers, once a symbol of America's economic power, crumbled to the ground. The Pentagon, the nerve center of America's military might, was also severely damaged. Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, was identified as the mastermind behind these horrific acts. The attacks resulted in the tragic loss of nearly 3,000 lives, and the world cried out for justice. Osama bin Laden, once an ally of the United States during the Soviet-Afghan War, now became its most wanted enemy. Following the attacks, a video surfaced in which Osama admitted responsibility, further fueling international outrage. The United States, under President George W. Bush, launched Operation Enduring Freedom, an international military campaign aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and bringing bin Laden to justice. The hunt for Osama was on, but he proved to be an elusive target, evading capture for nearly a decade. Finally, in May 2011, the manhunt ended. A covert operation by the United States Navy SEALs led to the killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The news of his death was met with a mixture of relief, triumph, and a sense of closure for the victims' families. Yet it did not mark the end of al-Qaeda or global terrorism. Osama bin Laden's life might have ended, but his impact continues to reverberate. His legacy, one of violence and extremism, has influenced a new generation of radical groups. The world is still grappling with the aftermath of his actions, a stark reminder of the enduring power of ideas, however misguided or malevolent they may be.